Hey everyone, welcome back to Professor Crime for Sleep. Today we've got another true crime story for you. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss one of our daily episodes. Before we dive in, let me know where you're listening from and what time you're listening right now. I love seeing how global our community is. Alright, grab your headphones and settle in. Let's get into today's mystery. Story 1, her last cheer. She told him she was keeping the baby. He texted back, cold as ice. I already handled it. Just 2 days later, a chill settled over the small Texas town when police started asking about her. Where was she? He calmly pointed across the field, his voice flat. She's under the goalpost. No pleasantries, no gentle introduction. Just the brutal, unvarnished facts that ripped through a quiet Texas high school community, dragging it kicking and screaming into a nightmare none of them saw coming. How does a story start so normal and end so dark? Kennedale, Texas. A town that lived in BR. He said he'd get an abortion, but he had a darker plan. Youth football, where Friday night lights weren't just a game, they were a religion. And at the altar of that religion stood Matthew Alvarez. 16 years old, 6'1", a quarterback with a cannon arm and a smile that could charm the paint off a locker. He was everything a town like Kennedale worshipped, the golden boy destined for greatness. Parents adored him. He still had the manners to say, "Yes, ma'am." A rare gem in a generation often accused of forgetting their pleases and thank yous. Teachers? They loved him too. A solid 3.6 GPA, and he managed it without ever seeming to break a sweat or beg for extra credit. He was the kind of kid who made everyone proud, the embodiment of small-town success. Then there was Madison Maddie Wilson, 15, a JV cheerleader whose spirit was as bright as her uniform. She was his biology lab partner, a whirlwind of energy who laughed louder than the marching band on game day. Friends would tell you Maddie had a unique talent. She could roast you with a sarcastic jab and then pull you into a hug, all in the same breath. She was vibrant, she was kind, and she was fiercely loyal. Their story began the summer before freshman year. A classic teenage romance, the kind you see in movies. Dates at the Arlington Highlands, sharing milkshakes at the Sonic, endless hours just being. It felt like practice for real life, a sweet, innocent prelude to adulthood. Nobody batted an eye when their social media feeds filled with the usual selfies, tongues out, tigers' caps backwards, heart emojis plastered everywhere. They were the couple. In the bustling hallways of Kennedale High, they were inseparable, always holding hands, a silent testament to their young love. At parties, they'd vanish upstairs for 20 minutes, only to reappear smelling faintly of weed and Bath and Body Works. It was high school normal, so normal it almost felt boring. Predictable, comfortable, until October arrived and Maddie's period didn't. That missed period shattered their perfectly normal, predictable world. Maddie's heart hammered a frantic rhythm as she walked into the CVS on Little Road, her hands trembling as she picked up a 3-pack of pregnancy tests. The 2 pink lines that blazed across each strip confirmed her worst fear. She was pregnant. Her first instinct, raw and urgent, was to call her best friend, Bree. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered the news, her voice barely audible. Bree, bless her heart, tried to offer comfort, but the weight of the revelation was immense. Second instinct, almost a reflex, was to call Matthew. He was the other half of this impossible equation. He answered on the second ring, the loud, chaotic clatter of the cafeteria echoing behind him. "Hey Mads, what's up?" he asked, oblivious. Maddie, her voice cracking, managed to get out the words, "I'm pregnant." A beat of absolute silence stretched between them, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the cafeteria noise. Then, Matthew's voice, tight with disbelief. "Are you sure?" She didn't need to say anything more. She just snapped a photo of the test stick, those 2 damning pink lines, and sent it to him. Proof. Irrefutable. Within the hour, Matthew was pacing the bleachers, his face grim as he FaceTimed her. His voice, usually so confident, was barely a whisper, urgent and laced with an icy fear. "You can't have it," he insisted, his eyes darting around as if someone might overhear. "My dad will kill me. My coach will bench me. We'll lose state." His entire future, his carefully constructed identity, flashed before his eyes, and it was all crumbling. Maddie, still crying, tried to inject a sliver of hope. "I'm only 6 weeks, Matt. I checked. We still have time. She knew Texas law at that moment allowed abortion up to 20 weeks. In her mind, they had options, they were fine. There was a path through this. But Matthew wasn't thinking about paths. He was already spiraling, his fingers frantically scrolling through the darkest corners of Reddit threads. Custody battles, crippling child support payments, scholarships evaporating, his football dreams turning to dust. He saw only catastrophe, a life sentence he hadn't signed up for. That night, he typed and retyped a text message, agonizing over every word, trying to make it sound loving, desperate, anything to sway her. Please, Mads. I love you. Get rid of it. He sent it, then stared at his phone, waiting. She didn't reply for 12 agonizing hours. When she finally did, it wasn't a text. It was a voice memo, her voice tremulous but firm. I'm keeping the baby. My mom will help. You don't have to stay. Matthew listened to it once, the words a hammer blow to his carefully constructed future. Then, with a chilling deliberation, he deleted it. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the dark thoughts swirling, until the first rays of the sun pierced through his window. The next practice, he overthrew every single pass, his focus shattered, his golden touch gone. Coach, bewildered by his star player's sudden collapse, benched him anyway. The beginning of his nightmare had already started. Matthew Alvarez wasn't a guy who was used to losing. In his world, there was always a solution, always a way to win. This situation, however, felt like a defeat of epic proportions, a public shame waiting to happen. So he turned to what he knew best, planning. Tucked away in his duffel bag, alongside his cleats and mouthguard, was a spiral notebook. Police would later call it the list. And it was a chilling testament to a mind already veering into darkness. Page 1 was titled, ominously, Ways Out. Adoption, he scratched it out. Too public. Too many questions. His name, potentially, still attached. Runaway. He dismissed it with a terse note. She won't. He knew Maddie, knew her loyalty, her fierce spirit. She wouldn't abandon her child. Miscarriage, a single, chilling word next to it. How? The implication hung heavy, a nascent thought of violence already forming. Abortion, he questioned. Too late? He knew Maddie had time, but in his mind, every day was a day closer to his life being irrevocably altered. Then came page 2. If nothing works, take care of it myself. He circled that last line. For a week, he kept circling it, drawing arrows connecting it to other thoughts, doodling crude, menacing rifles in the margins. The abstract thought solidified into a concrete, terrifying intention. Meanwhile, Maddie's morning sickness had begun to hit her with a vengeance. The nausea was relentless, forcing her to miss morning practice. Coach, unaware of the real reason, benched her from cheer. Her world, too, was shrinking, becoming isolated. She confided in Bree, her voice small and hurt. I think he hates me. Bree, with the well-meaning but ultimately naive wisdom of a 15-year-old, offered what every teenager hopes to hear. He'll come around. They always do. But Bree didn't know Matthew. She didn't know the cold calculation brewing in his mind. Matthew didn't come around. He was too busy researching. His phone became a portal to the macabre. He Googled, how long can you bury something before dogs find it? A chilling insight into his logistical concerns. Then, even more disturbingly, how deep for body not to bloat up, followed by the truly horrifying, quick death shot placement. These weren't the searches of a boy grappling with a mistake. They were the meticulous research of a killer. On a Wednesday, 3 days before the next home game, he made his final entry in the notebook. A simple, terrifying instruction, Friday night. Field empty after game. Tell her we need to talk. The plan was set. The trap was laid. Friday, November 3rd. The air crackled with the energy of another Kennedale Tigers home game. The stands were packed, the cheers thunderous. The Tigers won, a decisive 38-7 victory. Matthew Alvarez, the Golden Boy quarterback, threw 2 touchdowns. He was oddly calm on the field, almost serene. No exuberant celebrations, no high-fives with teammates. Just a quiet, focused execution, as if he were simply ticking off items on a list. His coaches and teammates thought he was just mature, focused on the bigger picture. Little did they know the bigger picture he was actually focused on. After the crowd had cleared, the last stragglers heading home, Matthew sent a text to Maddie. Meet me under the visitor stands. I want to apologize." Maddie, ever hopeful, ever in love, saw a glimmer of the old Matthew, a chance for reconciliation. She slipped away from the locker room corridor, pulling her hoodie over her cheer uniform, perhaps to hide the hope or the fear in her eyes. Surveillance footage, grainy and silent, later captured them walking side by side. Two figures, bathed in the faint, distant glow of the stadium lights, heading towards the dark, isolated practice field beyond. It was the last time Matty Wilson would be seen alive, walking freely. According to his taped confession, given days later, Matthew recounted the final, horrific moments. His voice, devoid of emotion, played back to stunned investigators. "I asked one more time," he said, referring to his plea for her to get an abortion. She said, "I'm 15, Matt. I'm scared, but I can't kill it." Her words, a desperate plea for understanding, a declaration of maternal instinct, were met with cold finality. "I kept the gun in my waistband," he continued, his voice flat. "I thought I'd just scare her." A chilling claim, one that police found hard to believe given his meticulous planning. But she turned to walk away. That was it. Her decision to walk away, to reclaim her autonomy, sealed her fate. I pointed. I closed my eyes. I shot once. She dropped. The clinical detachment was horrifying. I didn't know if she was dead. I shot again so she wouldn't tell. 2 shots. One to silence her, another to ensure her permanent silence. Then, with a casual brutality that defied comprehension, he dragged her body 10 yards to the equipment shed. He covered her with a tarp, weighing it down with spare tackle bags. Just another chore, another problem handled. Afterward, he went home. He showered, washing away the grime of the field, and presumably the blood. Then, as if nothing had happened, he logged onto his console and played Fortnite with his squad, chatting and laughing into his headset. When his mom, noticing his unusual energy, asked why he seemed hyper, he simply shrugged. "Just amped from the win," he told her. A perfect lie, a perfect facade. Saturday morning dawned, crisp and clear, but for Tara Wilson, Maddie's mom, it brought only a growing sense of dread. She knocked on Maddie's door, but there was no answer. The bed was empty. A cold knot formed in her stomach. Panic began to set in. She checked Find My iPhone, a digital lifeline that usually showed her daughter's every move. Offline since 11:07 p.m. last night. Her heart sank. By noon, the family group chats had exploded. Fear spread like wildfire. Volunteers began to gather at the local softball complex, their faces etched with worry, handing out color flyers with Maddie's smiling face. The community rallied, as small towns do, hoping against hope. Matthew showed up, wearing his Letterman jacket, the picture of concern. He hugged Tara, his voice thick with feigned sympathy. "We'll find her," he promised, looking her directly in the eyes. A predator hiding in plain sight, playing the role of the worried boyfriend. Sunday brought the police, and with them, polygraphs. A standard procedure in missing persons cases, especially when a boyfriend is involved. Matthew, ever the cooperative citizen, volunteered to go first. Detective Ramirez, his gaze steady, asked the seemingly innocent question, "Where were you between midnight and 1?" Matthew, without missing a beat, replied, "With the team, then home." A solid alibi, if you didn't dig too deep. The polygraph technician, however, reported the results as inconclusive, citing Matthew's nerves. They let him go, but a seed of doubt had been planted. That seed began to sprout when cell tower data came back. It placed Matthew's phone near the practice field, not his home, until 12:42 a.m. His story wasn't holding up. The timeline was off. By Monday, the search had intensified. Cadaver dogs, their keen noses tuned to the scent of death, were brought in. They alerted on the practice field, precisely where Matthew's phone had pinged. The grim reality began to set in. That afternoon, officers strolled into Kennedale High. Matthew Alvarez, the Golden Boy quarterback, was escorted out of English class, his face impassive, in front of his stunned, whispering classmates. The facade was cracking. In the sterile interview room, Detective Ramirez slid a photo across the table. It was Maddie, her 8th grade smile radiant and innocent. Matthew stared at it for 90 long seconds, his face a mask. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm, controlled. "I want a lawyer." The first sign of his carefully constructed composure beginning to fray. Ramirez leaned in, his voice low and intense. You pointed across the field once already, Matthew. Save us the digging. He was referring to Matthew's chilling text to Maddie about handling it. The detective knew. He knew Matthew had already confessed in his own twisted way. Matthew paused, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Then, with a chilling resignation, he replied, She's under the goalpost. I already told you I took action. He then drew a map, a crude but accurate diagram of where he had left Maddie. The truth, stark and brutal, was finally out. The interview transcript from that day, lightly redacted, painted a chilling portrait of a mind devoid of empathy, driven by pure self-preservation. Detective Ramirez, seasoned and stoic, tried to understand the twisted logic. Ramirez, walk me through the plan, Matthew. From the moment you decided. Matthew, I figured if she wasn't pregnant, problem solved. If she was, I'd solve it. I had a week. His words were cold, calculated, like he was discussing a football play. There was no remorse, no hesitation in his tone. The pregnancy was a problem, and he was the one to solve it, no matter the cost. Ramirez, why not run away, Matthew? Join the army, anything to get out of it. The detective was trying to find a shred of youthful desperation, a moment of panic that led to a terrible mistake. Matthew, couldn't let my little brother hear I quit on the kid. Couldn't let my dad see me pay for a baby. This felt cleaner. The answer hung in the air, a testament to the suffocating pressure he felt, the toxic masculinity that prioritized reputation over life. He feared the shame, the loss of his carefully cultivated image, more than he feared taking a life. His younger brother, his father, his coach. These were the figures whose judgment he couldn't face. Ramirez, cleaner? You call this cleaner? The detective's voice held a hint of incredulous disbelief, trying to penetrate the boy's icy composure. Matthew, it's one moment. Done. Over. For Matthew, murder was an efficient solution, a single, decisive action that would erase his problem and allow him to reclaim his life, his future. The finality of death was, in his warped mind, preferable to the messy, ongoing responsibility of fatherhood. Ramirez, you feel anything when you fired? Any regret? Any fear? Matthew, recoil. Just the physical kickback of the weapon. Nothing more. No emotion for the girl he had loved, for the life he had extinguished, for the child whose existence he had denied. His response was a stark, horrifying window into a complete absence of empathy. And perhaps the most damning detail of all, the one that underscored the chilling depth of his detachment, he never once asked if the baby was okay. He already knew. In his mind, the baby was merely an extension of the problem, and he had handled both. The legal machinery of Tarrant County ground into motion with chilling efficiency. A grand jury, after hearing the evidence, indicted Matthew Alvarez as an adult. The charges were swift and severe, 2 counts of capital murder. One for Maddie Wilson, and, under Texas law, a separate count for the unborn child, defined unequivocally as an individual. This distinction, recognizing the unborn as a victim, added another layer of gravity to an already horrific case. Given his age, 16 at the time of the crime, prosecutors made the decision not to seek the death penalty. While capital murder usually carries that possibility, the legal system often shows leniency for minors, even in the most heinous cases. Instead, the focus shifted to securing a conviction that would ensure he spent the vast majority of his life behind bars. Matthew's defense team, facing an overwhelming mountain of evidence, hired 2 forensic psychiatrists. Their strategy was clear: paint Matthew as a victim of adolescent brain immaturity, impulsivity, and an undiagnosed depression. They argued that a 16-year-old's prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making and impulse control, isn't fully developed, making him prone to poor judgment. They suggested he was a troubled boy, overwhelmed and acting out of a temporary, severe mental state. But the prosecution had a powerful counter-narrative. They presented the list, Matthew's spiral notebook, detailing his chilling, methodical planning. They showed the jury his internet search history, the queries about burial depths, shot placement, the cold, calculating research. They laid out the evidence of the gun purchase, the casual acquisition of a deadly weapon for a specific, murderous purpose. This wasn't impulsive. This was premeditated. This was a plan, executed with terrifying precision. Pretrial motions, battles over evidence, psychological evaluations, and legal technicalities dragged on for 8 months. The legal wrangling was intense, each side fighting to define Matthew's actions, to shape the narrative for a potential jury. Finally, facing the undeniable weight of the evidence and the likelihood of a life sentence without parole, Matthew accepted a plea bargain. He pleaded guilty to capital murder in exchange for a sentence of life with the possibility of parole after 40 years. A lifetime behind bars, with a distant, almost theoretical chance at freedom when he would be in his late 50s. The judge read the sentence, his face a stone-faced mask of solemnity. He then turned to the gallery, his voice resonating with a quiet gravity. Some choices you can't unchoose. May God grant healing to every life touched by this tragedy. Matthew, sitting beside his lawyers, showed no emotion. No remorse, no tears, no flicker of regret. Just the same blank stare he'd worn through much of the trial. But in the gallery, Tara Wilson, Maddie's mom, couldn't contain her anguish. A raw, guttural scream tore from her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated pain, echoing through the silent courtroom until bailiffs gently, respectfully, helped her out. For her, and for Maddie's baby, there would be no parole, no release from their sentence of grief. In the wake of such a profound tragedy, a community grapples with how to move forward. Kennedale ISD, the school district that had once celebrated Matthew Alvarez as a hero, took steps to mend. They installed brighter LED lamps across all athletic fields, a small, practical measure that spoke volumes. Perhaps, unconsciously, an attempt to banish the shadows where such darkness had taken root. Maddie's cheer jersey, vibrant purple and white, was retired. It was framed and hung in the front office of the high school, a silent, poignant memorial to a life cut tragically short. Students, trying to make sense of the senseless, organized a purple and white balloon release, purple being Maddie's favorite color. Hundreds of balloons ascended into the Texas sky, a fragile symbol of hope and remembrance against a backdrop of sorrow. National news outlets descended on Kennedale like vultures, their headlines screaming, "The football star killer, the pregnant cheerleader, the small town that thought it was immune." The story became a grim cautionary tale, a sensationalized narrative that overshadowed the quiet grief of a community. It sparked national conversations about teenage pregnancy, abortion, toxic masculinity, and the pressures on young athletes. Today, Matthew Alvarez is an inmate in the Clemens Unit, a state prison in Brazoria County, Texas. Inmate records list his occupation as custodial helper. He turns 21 next month, marking yet another year spent behind bars, his golden future replaced by the stark, monotonous reality of prison life. Maddie Wilson would have been 19 now. She would have been starting college, or perhaps embarking on a career full of life and laughter. Her mom, Tara, visits the grave every Tuesday, a ritual of enduring grief. She kneels, gently wiping dirt from the tiny headstone, its simple inscription a heartbreaking testament to what was lost. Madison Lee Wilson, baby girl, gone too soon. And beside it, another, even smaller marker, a silent acknowledgement of the life that never had a chance to begin. If this story, this stark reminder of innocence lost and future stolen, resonated with you, please hit that like button. Your engagement helps ensure more people confront these difficult truths and understand how quickly teenage rage, unchecked and unaddressed, can turn lethally destructive. Subscribe for our weekly deep dives into the cases that challenge our understanding of humanity. And please, drop a comment below. What would you tell a kid who, feeling cornered, thinks violence is the only reset button? What message do we need to send to prevent another tragedy like Maddie's? Your voice, your perspective, might just be the one that keeps somebody else alive. Matthew Alvarez told police he took action because he couldn't stand the idea of losing control. He believed he was solving a problem, preserving his future, maintaining his image. But the only thing he actually lost, irrevocably, was the girl who once cheered his name the loudest and the child who never got to hear it at all. He lost his freedom, his future, and any semblance of the golden boy he once was. Remember Maddie and her baby when you hear people argue that kids always make rational choices, that they always know better. Sometimes, the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun, easily spotted and feared. Sometimes it's a 16-year-old mind, twisted by fear and entitlement, that believes consequences can simply be buried under a goalpost, out of sight, out of mind. May we learn to spot those minds, to intervene, to offer support and guidance before the lights go out for good. Story 2: How Two Geniuses Botched the Perfect Murder. In 1924, two young men were convinced they were gods among mortals. Their names were Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, wealthy, charismatic, and certified geniuses. They decided to prove their intellectual dominance by committing the perfect crime, a murder so flawlessly executed it would baffle police and cement their legend. They planned for 7 long months, considering every angle and, in their minds, leaving nothing to chance. But in their obsessive quest for perfection, they overlooked one tiny detail, a mistake that wouldn't just unravel their masterpiece, but would expose their genius for what it truly was: catastrophic arrogance. This is the story of how two of the most brilliant minds of their time orchestrated what they thought was a flawless murder, only to commit a series of blunders that turned their perfect crime into a perfect failure. On the surface, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb had it all. Born into immense wealth in Chicago's exclusive Kenwood neighborhood, their lives were a portrait of privilege. Their families were pillars of the community. Loeb's father was a retired vice president of Sears, Roebuck and Company, and Leopold's was a shipping and manufacturing magnate. And from a very young age, it was obvious that both boys were exceptionally smart. Richard Loeb, known as Dickie, was the charming, handsome, and gregarious one. He was the kind of guy who could talk his way into and out of just about anything. His intellect was staggering. He became the youngest graduate in the history of the University of Michigan, finishing his degree at just 17. But beneath that polished exterior was a mind consumed by a dark obsession: crime. While other boys were reading sports pages, Loeb was devouring detective stories, not for the thrill of justice, but for the thrill of the chase. He didn't want to be a detective. He fantasized about becoming a master criminal, someone smart enough to outwit the authorities at every turn. Nathan Leopold, or Babe, was a different kind of genius. More introverted and awkward, he was a prodigy in the truest sense. By 19, he'd already graduated from the University of Chicago and was making plans for Harvard Law School. He was a nationally recognized ornithologist, an expert on birds, and was said to have an IQ of around 210, capable of speaking an incredible 9 languages. Leopold was drawn to the complex and the esoteric, and his intellectual adventures led him to the work of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and his concept of the Übermensch, or Superman. Leopold grabbed onto a twisted interpretation of Nietzsche's philosophy. He came to believe that certain superior individuals, simply because of their massive intellect, were exempt from the ordinary rules and laws that govern the masses. In a letter to Loeb, he laid out this terrifying belief: a Superman is, on account of certain superior qualities inherent in him, exempted from the ordinary laws which govern men. He is not liable for anything he may do. Though they knew each other as kids, their fateful bond was really forged at the University of Chicago. It was intense, complex, and deeply manipulative. Leopold was infatuated with Loeb, later writing, "Loeb's friendship was necessary to me, terribly necessary." Loeb, charismatic and exploitative, recognized this devotion. He held a powerful sway over Leopold, trading affection and intimacy for complicity in his escalating criminal fantasies. This toxic dynamic started with petty crimes. They'd commit arson, throw bricks through windows, and pull off minor thefts, all for the sheer exhilaration of it. For Loeb, the act itself was the point, but Leopold needed a philosophical justification. He framed their actions through his distorted Nietzschean worldview. They weren't just delinquents. They were supermen, testing the boundaries of conventional morality. But these small-time offenses quickly got boring. Loeb craved a bigger stage. He wanted to commit a crime that wouldn't just break the law, but would shock the world and prove, once and for all, their intellectual supremacy. He wanted to commit the perfect crime. Leopold, desperate to please Loeb, agreed. The pact was sealed. Their shared arrogance and twisted philosophies created a feedback loop, each one reinforcing the other's delusions of grandeur. In their own minds, they weren't just two brilliant students anymore. They were transcendent beings, about to execute a plan so perfect, so audacious, that it would echo through history as an act of pure, unadulterated genius. They believed they were above the law, above morality, and above consequences, and that belief would lead them down a path to conspire, to kidnap, and to kill. The plan to commit the perfect crime began to take shape in November 1923, a full 7 months before the act itself. For Leopold and Loeb, this murder wasn't about passion or revenge, it was an intellectual exercise. The thrill wasn't in the violence, but in the meticulous, cold-blooded planning, the creation of a flawless criminal masterpiece. The goal was simple: to experience the ultimate thrill and to prove that their superior intellects could devise a crime that police would be utterly powerless to solve. They spent months debating every conceivable detail, approaching the project with the same academic rigor they applied to their university studies. They decided the crime had to look like a professional job, which meant a kidnapping followed by a ransom demand. This would obscure their true motive, which was, quite simply, the act of murder itself. Killing the victim was a non-negotiable part of the plan. A live victim could identify them, and identification was the enemy of perfection. Their preparations were astonishingly detailed. To create the ransom note, they didn't just use any typewriter. In an act of convoluted genius, they actually stole an Underwood typewriter from Loeb's old fraternity house, typed the note addressed generically to "Dear Sir," and then returned it, believing this would make the note completely untraceable. Next, they sorted out the logistics. They established a fake identity, Morton D. Ballard, which they used to rent a dark blue Willis Knight automobile. This car, they figured, would give them anonymity as they cruised their own neighborhood looking for a victim. They bought supplies with chilling foresight: a chisel from a hardware store to use as a weapon, rope, and hydrochloric acid to disfigure the victim's body and prevent identification. The ransom collection was designed to be an impossibly complex puzzle. The plan involved a series of intricate, sequential instructions. The first call would direct the ransom payer to a specific spot, where they'd get another call with the next set of directions, and so on. The final step involved throwing the money from a moving train. It was a scheme straight out of the detective novels Loeb loved so much, designed to be so convoluted that law enforcement couldn't possibly follow or intercept it. The choice of victim was, in their minds, completely impersonal. For months, they didn't have a specific target, only a type: a young boy from a wealthy family in their Kenwood neighborhood. This was purely practical. A rich family could pay the $10,000 ransom, and a local kid would be easier to lure into their car. They considered several potential victims, but ultimately decided to leave the final choice to chance, picking whoever was most convenient on the day itself. Throughout these 7 months, their arrogance was boundless. They saw themselves as puppeteers and everyone else, their victim, the police, the public, as pawns in their intellectual game. One of them, seated in the back, lunged forward and struck Bobby over the head multiple times with the steel chisel. The boy didn't die instantly as they'd planned. Panicking, they pulled him into the back seat and forced a gag into his mouth to stifle his cries. Within moments, Bobby Franks suffocated. With the body of their young victim lying on the floor of the back seat, covered by a blanket, they began the next phase. For hours, they drove aimlessly, waiting for darkness to dispose of the body. In a chilling display of their complete detachment, they pulled over and bought sandwiches for supper, eating them in the car while Bobby's body lay at their feet. As night fell, they drove south of Chicago to a remote, marshy area near Wolf Lake, a spot they had scouted previously. There, by a lonely culvert, they dragged the boy's body from the car. In a futile attempt to hide his identity, they poured hydrochloric acid on his face and body before stripping off his clothes. They then unceremoniously shoved the body into the narrow drainage pipe, convinced it wouldn't be found for weeks, if ever. But in their haste, they were careless. Bobby's feet remained partially visible from the opening. Their task seemingly complete, they drove back toward the city. They stopped to mail the ransom note they had so carefully prepared, and, later that evening, Leopold called the Franks household. Identifying himself as George Johnson, he coldly informed Bobby's mother that her son was kidnapped but safe, and that instructions would follow. They then got rid of the boy's clothes and tried to clean the blood from the rented car, telling a chauffeur who offered to help that they had just spilled some red wine. They believed they had executed their plan to perfection. The murder was done, the body hidden, the ransom demand initiated. They returned to their lives, even discussing the sensational news of the Franks' kidnapping with a feigned, morbid curiosity. They were sure they were in the clear, but in the darkness by that lonely culvert, in the frantic moments of hiding Bobby Franks' body, something had happened that neither of them noticed. As Leopold leaned over, something small and light slipped from his coat pocket and fell, unseen, into the muck. It was a single, seemingly insignificant object, a pair of horn-rimmed eyeglasses. This tiny, overlooked detail, a product of pure carelessness, was the first major blunder in their perfect crime. It was the crack in the foundation of their elaborate scheme, and it would soon bring their entire world of arrogant self-delusion crashing down. Leopold and Loeb believed they had days, if not weeks, before anyone could possibly piece together what they'd done. They were wrong. The unraveling of their masterpiece began less than 24 hours after the murder. On the morning of May 22, 1924, a worker walking near Wolf Lake noticed something pale sticking out of a drainage culvert. It was the body of Bobby Franks. The discovery instantly turned a kidnapping into a murder investigation, and the case became front-page news across the country. Chicago was gripped by horror and fascination. Who could do something so monstrous? The police, under immense public pressure, launched a massive investigation. At first, they were baffled. The ransom note, the hidden body, it all pointed to a professional, cold-blooded killer. But there were almost no clues. Then, investigators found the critical piece of evidence, the pair of horn-rimmed eyeglasses found in the mud where the body had been disposed. Detectives realized this was their only real lead. The glasses weren't a common style. They had a very distinctive, patented hinge connecting the earpiece to the frame. Police painstakingly traced the spectacles. They took them to an optometrist, who identified the unique hinge as exclusive to his shop. He told police he'd only ever sold 3 pairs of glasses with that specific hinge. The owners of the first 2 pairs were quickly cleared. The third pair, the optometrist's records showed, had been prescribed to a brilliant young law student named Nathan Leopold. On May 29th, 8 days after the murder, detectives arrived at the Leopold mansion. They didn't consider him a prime suspect yet. After all, he was a wealthy, respected scholar. They just wanted to ask about the glasses. When questioned, Leopold was the picture of cool confidence. He examined the glasses and calmly admitted they looked like his, but claimed his own pair was safely at home. When a search of his house failed to turn them up, he launched into a ready-made alibi. He told investigators that he was an avid birdwatcher and often visited the Wolf Lake area for his studies. He must have lost the glasses, he explained, on a recent birding trip. He was so confident in this story that he even offered reporters and police his expert theories on the crime. He casually remarked to one officer that if he were to murder someone, it would have likely been that cocky little son of a bitch, Bobby Franks. At first, police were inclined to believe him. Leopold's social standing and reputation made him an unlikely killer. To back up his story, he told police that on the day of the murder, he and Richard Loeb had been driving around in his car, picking up girls. When police questioned Loeb separately, he confirmed the alibi perfectly. For a moment, it seemed their story might actually hold. But the investigators remained skeptical. The police decided to dig deeper. They began scrutinizing every detail of the boy's alibi, unaware that they were about to pull on a thread that would cause the entire tapestry of the perfect crime to unravel with astonishing speed. The geniuses had made their second critical error. They provided a detailed, specific alibi, one that could be verified or, as it turned out, completely dismantled. The confident facade of Leopold and Loeb began to crumble under the intense police scrutiny. While their alibis seemed to match, the state's attorney, Robert Crowe, wasn't convinced. He sensed inconsistencies and ordered his team to verify every single detail. The fatal blow to their perfect alibi came not from a brilliant piece of detective work, but from a mundane and unexpected source, the Leopold family chauffeur. In an attempt to help his employer's son, the chauffeur told police that Nathan's story of driving around with Loeb couldn't be true. He stated unequivocally that Nathan's car, the specific car Leopold claimed they were using, had been in the garage for repairs the entire day of the murder. It was an irrefutable fact that shattered their carefully constructed narrative. The alibi was a lie. Confronted with this, the two supermen broke. Their intellectual arrogance evaporated, replaced by raw panic. On May 31st, just 10 days after the murder, Richard Loeb was the first to confess. He admitted to the kidnapping and murder, but immediately tried to minimize his role, insisting that Nathan Leopold had been the one to strike the fatal blows. Shortly after, when Leopold was told that Loeb had confessed, he broke down as well. But his confession told a different story. He claimed that he was just the driver and that it was Loeb who had actually killed Bobby Franks. Each genius, in a desperate attempt to save himself, pointed the finger at the other. Their pact of superiority, forged in arrogance and sealed in blood, was broken. They were no longer partners in crime. They were just two terrified young men, each betraying the other to save his own skin. The confessions sent shockwaves through the country. The story of two wealthy, brilliant young men murdering a child for the sheer thrill of it became a media sensation. Newspapers dubbed it the crime of the century, and the horrified, outraged public clamored for one thing: the death penalty. State's Attorney Robert Crowe confidently declared, "I have a hanging case." Facing certain conviction and the very real threat of execution, the Leopold and Loeb families did the only thing they could. They hired the most famous and formidable defense attorney in America, Clarence Darrow. Darrow was a towering figure in the legal world and a passionate, lifelong opponent of capital punishment. He wasn't interested in proving their innocence. That was impossible. He took the case for one reason: to save the boys from the gallows. The trial began in July 1924 and became a media spectacle. Darrow, knowing that no jury in the country would spare his clients, made a brilliant strategic move. He had Leopold and Loeb change their pleas from not guilty to guilty. This bypassed a jury trial and left the sentencing solely in the hands of a single judge, John R. Caverly. Darrow hoped that one man, stripped of the mob mentality of a jury, might be more receptive to an appeal for mercy. The trial thus became a 32-day sentencing hearing. The prosecution presented nearly 100 witnesses, painting Leopold and Loeb as cold, remorseless monsters who deserved to hang. Darrow's defense was revolutionary. He didn't argue that they were insane in the legal sense. Instead, he argued that their minds were diseased, warped by their upbringing, their obsessive relationship, and their dangerous philosophical delusions. For the first time in a major American trial, psychiatric testimony was introduced not to prove innocence, but as a mitigating factor to argue against the death penalty. A parade of alienists, as psychiatrists were then called, testified that the boys were mentally ill, driven by forces beyond their control. The entire case was a battle over the very nature of human responsibility, and at its center stood Clarence Darrow, preparing to make the most important argument of his life. The climax of the trial of the century was Clarence Darrow's closing argument. For over 12 punishing hours, spread across 2 days in a sweltering Chicago courtroom, Darrow spoke without notes, his voice rising and falling in one of the most powerful speeches in American legal history. His audience was a single man, Judge John R. Caverly, and his goal wasn't to exonerate, but to save. Darrow's summation was a sprawling, emotional, and philosophical masterpiece. He readily admitted the horrific nature of the crime. Instead, he sought to explain it. He painted a picture of two young men whose brilliant minds were also profoundly sick, warped by loveless childhoods and philosophical ideas they were too immature to comprehend. Nature is strong and she is pitiless, Darrow argued. She works in mysterious ways, and we are her victims. He relentlessly attacked the prosecution's call for blood, framing it as primitive, vengeful hatred. "I have heard in the last 6 weeks nothing but the cry for blood," he declared. "I have heard from the office of the state's attorney only ugly hate. I have seen a court urged almost to the point of threats to hang 2 boys, in the face of science, in the face of philosophy, in the face of humanity." His argument centered on their youth. They were 18 and 19, legally adults, but emotionally, Darrow contended, they were still just boys. He appealed to the judge's reason and compassion, arguing that the state shouldn't stoop to the same level of cold-blooded killing. He concluded his epic plea with a profound statement on mercy. I am pleading for the future. I am pleading for a time when hatred and cruelty will not control the hearts of men. When we can learn by reason and judgment and understanding and faith that all life is worth saving, and that mercy is the highest attribute of man. The speech left the courtroom, and the judge, visibly moved. On September 10, 1924, Judge Caverly delivered his sentence. While he condemned the crime in the strongest terms, he was ultimately persuaded by Darrow's arguments about their youth. He sentenced both Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb not to death, but to life in prison for the murder, plus 99 years for the kidnapping. Darrow had won. He had saved them from the hangman. Leopold and Loeb were sent to prison to begin their sentences. Their lives as intellectual elites were over. For a time, they were kept apart, but were eventually reunited at Stateville Penitentiary, where they helped establish a school for fellow inmates. But their story took one final, violent turn. On January 28, 1936, Richard Loeb was attacked in a prison shower room by another inmate who slashed him over 50 times with a straight razor. Loeb died shortly after, at the age of 30. The attacker claimed Loeb had made sexual advances, though many, including Leopold, believed it was the other way around. Nathan Leopold went on to serve 33 years in prison. He became a model prisoner, wrote his autobiography, Life Plus 99 Years, and was finally released on parole in 1958. He moved to Puerto Rico, married, earned a master's degree, and worked for a church-run hospital. He dedicated the rest of his life to quiet work, a stark contrast to the audacious crime of his youth. Leopold died of a heart attack in 1971 at the age of 66. In the end, the story of Leopold and Loeb isn't one of genius, but of spectacular failure. They set out to commit the perfect crime, an act so flawless it would prove they were above humanity. Instead, they committed a crime riddled with foolish mistakes, born not of intellect, but of breathtaking arrogance. Their grand philosophical justifications were exposed as the pathetic delusions of two emotionally broken young men. Their meticulous 7-month plan was undone in an instant by a single, careless act, the dropping of a pair of glasses. They aspired to be supermen, but their confessions revealed them to be nothing more than terrified children, each willing to betray the other to escape the consequences. Their legacy isn't that of a perfect crime, but a cautionary tale. It stands as one of history's most chilling examples of how intelligence without empathy and ambition without wisdom can lead not to greatness, but to tragedy and ruin. They sought to be remembered as gods, but they are remembered as the two geniuses who botched the perfect murder. What do you think is the most shocking part of this case? Was it their motive, their mistakes, or Clarence Darrow's incredible defense? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story fascinating, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Thanks for watching. Story 3: How a public genealogy website caught a serial killer. For 12 straight years, he stalked California, a phantom moving through the suburban nights, leaving a trail of terror that spanned the state. He was a rapist, a burglar, a killer, a shadow that seemed to vanish into thin air after each horrific act. Crime after crime, he left behind his genetic signature, a microscopic calling card of DNA, yet for decades, nobody, not even the most seasoned detectives, could tell them his name. 40 years later, the answer, the key to cracking the coldest case in American history, showed up in the most unexpected of places, a website built for sharing family photos and holiday recipes. It sounds like something out of a Hollywood thriller, doesn't it? But the truth is, the twist that finally brought a monster to justice started with nothing more than a single click. Stick around, because this story is going to change how you think about your family tree forever. I'm sure you've heard the chilling name, the Golden State Killer. His reign of terror across California in the 70s and 80s cemented him as one of the most prolific and elusive serial criminals in history. But today, we're not rehashing every grisly detail of his attacks. We're zeroing in on the truly groundbreaking, almost unbelievable breakthrough that finally shattered the mystery and brought him down. We're talking about a public, pay-at-will genealogy site, the very kind where your Aunt Sally might upload her spit-in-a-tube results to find distant relatives, that transformed into an unprecedented police dragnet. It's a game changer, and it raises some serious questions. If you've ever found yourself wondering, even just idly, could my second cousin inadvertently upload me into a courtroom? Well, you're about to find out exactly how that became a reality. This isn't just a true crime story. It's a story about the cutting edge of forensic science, the ethics of privacy, and the undeniable power of a digital footprint. This story begins in the California of the 1970s. It was a time of bell-bottoms and disco, of gas lines stretching around the block, and of suburban windows often left open, inviting a gentle breeze into homes. But into that seemingly idyllic picture crept a nightmare. Between 1974 and 1986, across a vast stretch of California, from the quiet streets of Sacramento down to the sun-drenched neighborhoods of Orange County, a prowler crept through those open windows. He was masked, gloved, a silent predator who would whisper chilling threats in the dark. He left a trail of fear, sexual assault, and murder that paralyzed communities. Law enforcement, initially bewildered by the seemingly unconnected crimes, struggled to grasp the scope of his depravity. They first knew him as the East Area Rapist, responsible for a terrifying string of sexual assaults and burglaries that began in Sacramento. But then, the violence escalated. The murders started, and with them, new, terrifying monikers emerged. The original Night Stalker, the Diamond Knot Killer. Each name reflected a different facet of his brutality, a different area he terrorized. Eventually, years later, he would be universally known as the Golden State Killer, a name that encompassed the totality of his horrific crimes. By the time his spree mysteriously ended in 1986, he had committed at least 13 murders and over 50 sexual assaults. The sheer volume and geographical spread of his crimes were unprecedented, baffling investigators. Every composite sketch looked slightly different. Every eyewitness account placed him miles apart, creating a frustratingly fragmented picture of their elusive suspect. It was like chasing a ghost. Yet, despite the chaos, there was one undeniable, microscopic link connecting the carnage: the biological evidence he left behind. Tiny traces of saliva on bindings, semen recovered from victims. These were his genetic fingerprints. Police had his DNA, a unique identifier of the monster. What they didn't have, however, was a name. They had his genetic blueprint, but they just didn't have the face to match it. The technology to translate that microscopic evidence into a human identity simply didn't exist yet, leaving families shattered and communities living in fear, with a phantom killer lurking in the shadows. The case went cold, a chilling testament to a killer's cunning and a technology's limitations. The 1990s dawned, and with them, a glimmer of hope. DNA science, while still in its infancy, was beginning to revolutionize forensic investigations. It was around this time that a dedicated, tenacious detective named Paul Holes joined the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office. He inherited a nightmare: boxes upon boxes of evidence related to the East Area Rapist/original Night Stalker case. The paper, he recalled, literally smelled like attic dust, a poignant reminder of how long these cases had languished. DNA science, as we know it today, was barely a concept back then. The sophisticated techniques and massive databases we rely on now were still decades away. So, Hull sent the precious, decades-old samples to labs that, by today's standards, could barely read half the genetic markers we expect. It was painstaking work, fraught with limitations. Yet, even with these early, rudimentary tools, the DNA profile they could extract was clean enough. It was enough to rule suspects in or out, to eliminate those who weren't the monster. And so began a grueling, often heartbreaking, process. Over the next 25 years, Paul Holes and his colleagues pursued every lead, every possible suspect. More than 100 men were swabbed, their DNA painstakingly compared to the killer's profile. One by one, they were cleared. Each clearance was a dead end, a fresh wave of frustration. Imagine the emotional toll, the countless hours, the dashed hopes, the weight of the unsolved crimes pressing down on them. Meanwhile, the victims' families aged, parents passed away, never seeing justice for their loved ones. The case file grew into a monumental, four-drawer memorial to frustration, a physical embodiment of a cold case that seemed destined to remain frozen in time. The killer, it seemed, had truly vanished, leaving behind only echoes of terror and an unidentifiable genetic signature. Holmes, however, refused to let it go. He carried the burden of those cases, a quiet promise to the victims that he wouldn't give up. He knew the DNA held the answer. They just needed the right key to unlock it. Fast forward to 2017. Investigative genealogy, the practice of using DNA to trace family trees, was still a relatively niche hobby. It was something for dedicated enthusiasts, people passionate about uncovering their heritage or connecting with long-lost relatives. But it wasn't widely known outside those circles, and certainly not recognized as a cutting-edge law enforcement tool. Paul Holes, ever the relentless investigator, stumbled upon a documentary. It wasn't about true crime, not directly anyway. It was about adoptees, individuals who, for years, had searched for their birth parents, finally finding connections through a free, open-source database called GeneMatch. This platform allowed anyone to upload their raw DNA results from commercial testing companies like 23andMe, Ancestry, or Family Tree DNA. Suddenly, people were reuniting with family members they never knew existed, all thanks to a digital family tree. As Holes watched, a light bulb, incandescent and brilliant, flickered on in his mind. If civilians could fish long-lost relatives out of the vast ocean of cyberspace, why couldn't cops do the same? Why couldn't they fish for a killer? The idea was audacious, unprecedented, and potentially revolutionary. He immediately emailed the district attorney, his message concise and urgent. "What's the legal hurdle?" The DA's response was, surprisingly, a shrug. There wasn't one. No specific law, no precedent, no clear prohibition against using public genealogy databases for criminal investigations. GeneMatch's terms of service, the often ignored fine print that most of us scroll past without a second glance, simply warned users that their data might be used for other purposes. That seemingly innocuous phrase, that vague disclaimer, would soon become the most explosive, game-changing fine print in the entire history of true crime investigations. It was an open door, a loophole that no one had anticipated, and it was about to change everything for the Golden State Killer case. The digital age, it turned out, held a secret weapon that the analog world of the 70s and 80s could never have imagined. But understanding how this digital manhunt worked is absolutely crucial, because you can't just type Golden State Killer into a search bar on a genealogy site and expect family trees to miraculously bloom. It's far more complex, and frankly, far more ingenious than that. First, the forensic labs had to perform a technological alchemy. The precious, decades-old crime scene DNA, the very evidence Paul Holes had guarded for so long, had to be converted. It needed to be transformed into the exact same raw data format used by commercial testing companies, a process known as S&P genotyping. Think of it like translating a unique language from the crime scene into the universal language of consumer DNA databases. This wasn't a trivial task. It required specialized expertise and cutting-edge equipment. Once that conversion was complete, the newly formatted DNA profile was uploaded to GeneMatch. The initial search returned a staggering 1,500 distant matches. But most of these matches shared only one tiny, minuscule segment of a chromosome. We're talking about fourth, fifth, or even sixth cousins, people who might share a common ancestor from the 1800s. Enter Barbara Ravener and C.C. Moore, two of the most brilliant and dedicated investigative genealogists in the field. Their task was Herculean, to build what are known as mirror trees. They started with these distant matches, tracing each one backward, meticulously researching public records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, census data, obituaries, to identify common ancestors. Then, the painstaking work of building forward began. From those common ancestors, they mapped every child, every grandchild, every great-grandchild, constructing an enormous, intricate spiderweb of family connections. After months of this meticulous, mind-numbing work, a pattern began to emerge. A specific branch of the family tree started to settle predominantly in California's Central Valley during the 1970s, precisely where and when the East Area rapists' crimes began. Through further genealogical research, they focused on two brothers. One was quickly ruled out. The other? His name was Joseph James D'Angelo. He was a retired police officer, living a seemingly quiet life in Citrus Heights, California. Polholes drove past D'Angelo's house. Just an ordinary man, washing dishes in plain view, in a perfectly ordinary suburban home. The sheer, mundane normalcy of it all was chilling. The ghost of California finally had a name and a face, hidden in plain sight for 40 years. Getting DNA from a private citizen, even a prime suspect, without a warrant is incredibly tricky, and investigators knew they had to tread carefully. They needed irrefutable proof, and they needed it legally. So, a meticulous surveillance operation began. Investigators shadowed Joseph James D'Angelo, watching his every move, patiently waiting for an opportunity. That opportunity came in a Hobby Lobby parking lot. D'Angelo discarded a tissue, a seemingly innocuous act that would seal his fate. The surveillance team swooped in, retrieving the tissue, which was rushed to the lab. The results were swift and devastatingly conclusive. The profile from the tissue matched the semen found at the crime scenes to a statistical certainty of 1 in 10 septillion. There was no longer any doubt. On April 24, 2018, the 40-year nightmare finally ended. SWAT teams swarmed D'Angelo's unassuming Citrus Heights home. The sudden flurry of unmarked cars and armed officers shocked the neighbors. Whispers quickly turned into shouts as news vans descended, and the question on every newscast that night echoed through the community. How did they catch him? The honest answer, the truly mind-boggling truth, was a website your cousin probably uses to verify their Viking ancestry. With Joseph D'Angelo in custody, the legal wheels began to turn. He was charged with 13 counts of murder, along with numerous special circumstance allegations that could potentially send him to death row. For the victims' families, who had waited decades, it was a bittersweet mixture of relief and renewed anguish as they braced for a trial that promised to be agonizingly long. Then, an unexpected force intervened, the COVID-19 pandemic. The prospect, they spoke his name aloud in court, replacing the anonymous boogeyman with the frail, handcuffed grandfather who shuffled when he walked. It was a moment of profound catharsis, a reclaiming of their stories, and a final, undeniable act of closure. The monster had a name, a face, and a sentence. While the world largely cheered the arrest of the Golden State Killer, the method by which he was caught sparked a heated and ongoing ethical debate. Civil liberties groups immediately raised alarms, posing a critical question. If law enforcement can rummage through public genealogy sites without a warrant, what stops governments from harvesting every genetic breadcrumb we leave behind? In the wake of D'Angelo's arrest, several states began to act. Maryland and Montana, for example, now require a warrant or court order before law enforcement can conduct forensic genealogy searches. GEDmatch, the very platform that facilitated the breakthrough, also reacted swiftly. It changed its policy, forcing users to opt in if they wanted their DNA profiles to be searchable by law enforcement. This seemingly small change had a massive impact, shrinking the searchable pool of DNA overnight. Meanwhile, private companies like Family Tree DNA struck direct contracts with the FBI, allowing law enforcement access to their customer database with user consent, sparking family feuds and intense public debate. The bottom line is clear. The same science that can nail serial killers also has the power to expose paternity secrets and unveil hidden adoptions. Once a distant relative you've never met uploads their DNA to a public database, your anonymity clock starts ticking. The arrest of Joseph D'Angelo was more than just the end of a nightmare. It was a seismic event that reverberated through the world of forensic science. Since his capture in 2018, investigative genetic genealogy, IgG, has become a powerful tool for law enforcement. It has closed more than 400 cold cases, bringing answers to families who had long given up hope. Cases like the 1987 double murder of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg in Washington state, or the 1993 slaying of Sophie Sergi in Alaska, were cracked using the same techniques. The technique works, fundamentally, because about 30 million people in the United States alone have provided saliva samples to commercial DNA testing companies. That's a massive, ever-growing database. And here's the kicker. Even if you never take a DNA test, a third cousin you've never met can inadvertently drag your shared heritage into a homicide file. Our DNA is a family affair, a shared legacy. The more people test, the smaller the world becomes for criminals hiding in the shadows. This naturally raises a practical question. What can you do if the thought of your genetic privacy keeps you up at night? First and foremost, read the terms of service before you submit a sample. Understand what you're agreeing to. Most commercial DNA testing companies will allow you to download your raw data and then delete your profile from their site. But here's the critical caveat. Once that raw data is copied and uploaded to third-party sites like GeneMatch, there's no recall button. You've essentially released that information into the digital wild. Another crucial point is that laws often lag significantly behind technology. Policies can change, but your genetic code is forever, meaning decisions you make today could have unforeseen implications down the road. And finally, it's vital to remember that genetic genealogy doesn't prove guilt. It only points investigators toward a suspect. Classic police work, surveillance, alibi checks, and gathering corroborating evidence is still absolutely necessary to build a case. It's the starting gun, not the finish line. Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, truly believed that time had buried his secrets, that he had faded into the comfortable anonymity of suburban life. But DNA is a patient time traveler. It never forgets, and it waits. All it needed was a public genealogy site, a few amateur family historians with an almost obsessive dedication, and one stubborn, visionary detective willing to follow branches back through a century of family trees. The same tools that people use to build their holiday family trees can also be wielded to topple monsters. This case stands as a monumental testament to the fact that science, when combined with relentless persistence and innovative thinking, forms arguably the deadliest combo in forensic history since the advent of fingerprinting. If this story made you rethink that innocent-looking DNA kit sitting on your shelf, or made you pause before you click agree on those terms of service, good. That's the first step toward making informed choices about your own genetic privacy in this rapidly evolving digital world. And if you're an armchair sleuth, itching for the next forensic twist, the future of true crime, it seems, is written in our genes. Story 4. This solved true crime story was cold for 40 years. Rust never sleeps, especially not in the damp, quiet corners of New Hampshire. Imagine this. It's a crisp November day in 1985. These four forgotten souls lay entombed in their steel coffins, their identities lost to time and a killer's deliberate cruelty. But the world, as they say, keeps turning and technology marches on. What seemed impossible for so long began to shift. A quiet revolution began brewing in living rooms across America, fueled by curious consumers and their DNA tests. Suddenly, the very fabric of family history, once a complex tapestry, became a digital map. And that map, combined with the tireless dedication of a handful of obsessive strangers online, was about to turn this entire, intractable case inside out. This isn't just a story about a crime. It's a testament to persistence, to the enduring power of memory, and to how one monster's own relatives, through an unexpected twist of fate, finally dragged him and his terrible secrets into the harsh, undeniable light. Let's rewind, back to that grim November day in 1985, the day the quiet tranquility of Bear Brook State Park was shattered. Detective John Cody, a veteran of countless cases, remembers the barrel vividly. He said it looked like trash, just another piece of human carelessness rolled down a hill and forgotten. But the smell, oh, the smell. It was sweet, cloying, metallic, the unmistakable odor of decay, a scent that speaks of death, not garbage. It was a smell that no seasoned officer could ignore, a smell that instantly told them this was something far more sinister than discarded industrial waste. The forensic technicians, working meticulously in the cold, lifted the remains. Their initial findings painted a stark picture. The adult female was estimated to be between 23 and 33 years old, standing around 5'2". What immediately stood out was her dental work. Extensive, expensive, a detail that spoke of a life that had, at some point, included access to good care. Beside her, the small body of a girl, perhaps 5 years old, with soft brown hair and a delicate, slightly built frame. The examination revealed the horrifying truth. Both had been brutally beaten, suffering blunt force trauma before being crammed into those plastic bags, then into the barrel, and left among the quiet birch and beech trees. It was a deliberate act of dehumanization, an attempt to erase them completely. Police immediately swung into action, or at least the action available to them in 1985. They printed thousands of flyers, distributed them far and wide, hoping someone, somewhere, would recognize a face, a description. They ran the dental charts, a critical piece of identification, through every database that existed at the time, which, let's be honest, wasn't nearly as comprehensive as today's systems. But they got nothing. No abandoned cars nearby that might suggest a struggle or a quick escape. No reports from campgrounds or park visitors that hinted at anything out of the ordinary. Even the scraps of clothing found offered no unique labels, no distinguishing marks that could point to a specific origin or store. By Christmas, a mere month after the discovery, the case file was already gathering dust, a thick, heavy folder marked unsolved. The leads had dried up, the initial flurry of activity had faded, and the woods, once again, held their secrets close. Locals, in a heartbreaking attempt to give some dignity to the nameless victims, started calling them the Bear Brook Angels. But angels, at least, have names, a history, people who remember them. These two had nothing. They were just gone. And then came the first montage every true crime fan knows by heart. The endless, repetitive grind of police work that yields no fruit. Cops knocking on doors in nearby towns, asking the same questions. Tracking down hikers who might have been in the park that fall, hoping for a fleeting memory. Following tips that came in, often well-intentioned, sometimes malicious, but always, frustratingly, leading nowhere. The sense of urgency, the initial shock, slowly gave way to a dull ache of frustration. And then, life, as it always does, moved on. For 15 long, agonizing years, the ancient woods of Bear Brook State Park kept their terrible secret, waiting. 15 years. Can you imagine? 15 years of silence, of the woods holding its breath. Then, in May of 2000, as the park began to shake off the last vestiges of winter, a park ranger was out updating trail maps. It was a routine task, something he'd done countless times. He was maybe 100 yards from where the first barrel was found, deep in a less traveled section of the park, when he stumbled upon it. Another rusted drum, almost identical to the first. He probably joked to his partner, a nervous laugh perhaps. Hope it's not another body. Spoiler alert, and a truly chilling one at that, it was. Two more. The grim discovery sent a jolt of ice through the entire department. This wasn't a one-off tragedy, a random act of violence. This was a pattern. Inside this second barrel were the remains of two more little girls. One, estimated to be between 2 and 3 years old. The other, somewhere between 1 and 4. The method was eerily, sickeningly familiar. Blunt force trauma. Their small bodies wrapped in plastic, stuffed into a barrel, and abandoned. And just like the first two, there was the same eerie, deliberate lack of clothing or personal effects that could have helped identify them. Suddenly, the Bear Brook case transformed from a single, horrific domestic violence homicide into something far more terrifying. The work of a serial killer. This wasn't a random act, it was a signature. A task force, larger and more coordinated than the previous effort, was immediately assembled. Police pulled every sex offender record in New England, sifting through thousands of names and photographs, desperately searching for a link. They even tried comparing dental isotope tests, a relatively new technique at the time that could indicate where someone had lived based on the chemical signatures in their teeth. The barrels themselves were painstakingly hauled to the FBI lab for toolmark analysis, hoping to match the crimping or sealing methods to other crimes. Nothing. Every avenue seemed to lead to a dead end. The media, as you can imagine, swarmed the park. The story of the Bear Brook barrels dominated headlines, sparking fear and outrage. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months without a breakthrough, the media, too, began to drift away, drawn to fresher, more immediate tragedies. By 2004, investigators, desperate for any shred of information, held a public vigil, a poignant plea to the community, hoping tips would surface. What they got instead was a deluge of psychics offering vague visions, false confessions from people craving attention, and even a child's poem, written in crayon, a heartbreaking attempt to make sense of the senseless. Frustration, over time, began to morph into folklore. The woods, once a place of recreation, became a place of dark legends. Teenagers dared each other to walk the trail at night, fueled by morbid curiosity and local whispers. Cops, trying to calm parents' frayed nerves, even installed fake cameras, hoping the illusion of surveillance would deter further incidents and ease the pervasive fear. Meanwhile, deep in the evidence lockers, a silent battle against time was being waged. The DNA, extracted from the remains, was quietly degrading. But then, a glimmer of hope. One lab tech, perhaps bolder than the rest, or just more attuned to emerging science, suggested, "Let's try the new thing, mitochondrial DNA." It was a cutting-edge technique then, different from nuclear DNA, inherited only from the mother. They managed to get a profile. But CODIS, the National DNA Database, was tiny in 2005, a mere shadow of what it is today. There were no matches. So, the case, despite this small scientific victory, slipped back into cold case limbo, for innocent souls still in their pod-like coffins, still nameless, still waiting for their story to be told. Jump cut to 2017. The world has changed. The internet is ubiquitous, smartphones are in every pocket, and suddenly, living room DNA kits are the hottest holiday gift. Everyone's doing it. You upload your raw data, and with a click, you can find third cousins in Latvia, discover your 2% Neanderthal, or trace your ancestry back to Viking warriors. It's fun, it's fascinating, and it's a social phenomenon. But behind the scenes, far from the holiday cheer and casual curiosity, a handful of visionary forensic anthropologists and genetic genealogists were realizing something profound. They understood that those same cousin matches, those digital breadcrumbs connecting distant relatives, could be used for something else entirely. They could work backward, not just to trace ancestry, but to identify unknown individuals. They could take crime scene DNA, upload it, and use the family trees of willing participants to find a killer or identify a victim. It was a revolutionary concept, and the Bear Brook detectives, still haunted by their cold case, were among the first to grasp its immense potential. They sent their mitochondrial DNA profile, the one gathered back in 2005, to a startup called Bode. And separately, crucially, they also sent it to a woman named Barbara Ravener. Now, Barbara wasn't your typical detective. She was a retired patent attorney, a brilliant mind who had, in her retirement, become an obsessive, self-taught genealogist. She had already made headlines for helping crack the infamous Golden State Killer hunt, proving the power of this new method. Barbara took the sequences, the raw genetic data, and uploaded them to GEDmatch. This was a game changer. GEDmatch is a public, free database that allows users to upload their raw DNA data from any commercial testing company, 23andMe, Ancestry, Family Tree DNA, whatever, and cross-compare results. It's a gold mine of genetic information voluntarily shared by millions. Within weeks, the digital branches began to sprout. Not just distant relatives, but second cousins in Florida, great-aunts in California. Barbara and her team meticulously started building family trees, painstakingly connecting the dots, working backwards through generations. They were looking for a common ancestor, a point where these disparate relatives converged. And as those family trees knit together, as the connections became clearer, a name began to surface, a name that would send shivers down the spines of investigators. Terry Petter Rasmussen. The pieces started to fall into place. Rasmussen was a handyman, a drifter who moved through the American Southwest, married multiple times, and, tellingly, used a bewildering array of aliases. And here was the crucial, heartbreaking link. He had a daughter named Ray Rasmussen, a little girl who had vanished in the late 1970s, seemingly without a trace. Investigators now had their prime suspect. But there was a twist, another layer to this already complex narrative. Terry Petter Rasmussen was dead. He had died in a California prison in 2010, not under his own name, but under the alias Curtis Kimball. And he wasn't just in prison. He was serving time for the murder of his then-girlfriend, Unsoon Jun. The police, armed with this incredible new lead, moved quickly. They obtained a court order to exhume Rasmussen's body from its California grave. They pulled nuclear DNA, the more robust and informative type, and compared it to the DNA from the victims in the barrels. And then, boom, the scientific confirmation they had waited decades for. A perfect, undeniable match to all four Bear Brook girls. For the first time in 32 agonizing years, someone knew who did it. The monster had a name, but the victims, those four innocent souls, still didn't have their names back. That was the next, equally challenging, step. Identifying a killer is a monumental achievement, a triumph of perseverance and science. But it's only half the battle. Identifying his victims, giving them back their dignity, their history, their very existence, is the other half, arguably the more profound one. For decades, these four girls were simply the Bear Brook victims, nameless statistics in a cold case file. Now, with the killer identified, the focus shifted entirely to them. Investigators started with the easiest breadcrumb, a tiny thread of hope in the vast labyrinth of the past. Ray Rasmussen. She was the middle child found in the second barrel, her age estimated at around 3. The DNA confirmed it. She was, unequivocally, Terry's biological daughter. Genealogists, working with law enforcement, then scoured records, chasing down every lead until they found her birth certificate. Arizona, 1978. A name, a date of birth, a beginning. News outlets updated their headlines with a cautious optimism. 1 down, 3 to go. The collective sigh of relief was palpable, but the work was far from over. Next, the genealogists turned their attention to the adult female, the first victim discovered in 1985. She had to be Ree's mother, or at least a very close relative. They used the genetic data, comparing shared centimorgans, those measurable segments of shared DNA, with hundreds of testers in the public databases. It was like piecing together a massive, complex puzzle, looking for patterns, for clusters of relatives that might point to her family line. Slowly, painstakingly, a cluster emerged, centered around Merced, California. This geographical clue was invaluable, narrowing their search considerably. Then, in 2019, a breakthrough that came not from a lab, but from a living room. A woman, scrolling through Facebook, saw a composite sketch of the adult victim that police had released. Her heart must have stopped. That looks like my missing big sister, Marlies, she thought. Marlies Elizabeth Honeychurch. She immediately called the tip line, a call that had been 41 years in the making. DNA from a surviving brother, a simple cheek swab, confirmed it. It was Marlies. Marlies Elizabeth Honeychurch, 24 years old, who had vanished with her toddler daughter after a heated argument at Thanksgiving in 1978. Second name, check. The pieces were falling into place, but the emotional weight of each discovery was immense. Now, only the 2 remaining girls, the youngest ones found in the second barrel, remained nameless. DNA had already confirmed they were siblings, a heartbreaking detail, but they weren't Marlies' children. The genealogists, undeterred, chased another branch of the growing family tree, following every lead, every distant cousin match. The search continued for 2 more years until, in 2021, another stroke of serendipity. A college kid in Colorado, simply curious about her ancestry, uploaded her DNA kit to a public database. And when her results were cross-referenced, a massive shared segment of 1,800 centimorgans lit up the screen, linking her directly to both of the remaining unidentified girls. The translation was clear. These 2 girls were her great-aunts, her grandmother's sisters. Further investigation, digging through old records and family stories, revealed that her grandmother had 2 younger daughters who had gone camping with Uncle Terry in New Hampshire back in 1980. They had never come back. Their names, finally, after decades of silence, Marie Vaughn, who was 6 years old, and Sarah McQuarters, who was just 5. By June of 2023, the unimaginable had happened. All 4 victims, once known only as the Bear Brook Angels, were officially restored. 40 years after a hunter's dog sniffed something odd in the leaf litter, every single person in those barrels finally had a name, a birth date, and people who remembered them. They were no longer nameless victims. They were Marlies, Ray, Marie, and Sarah. And their stories, at last, could begin to be told properly. Now that we've given the victims their names, let's zoom in on the monster who took them. Who was Terry Petter Rasmussen? On paper, his early life looked normal. Born in Denver in 1943, he enlisted in the Navy at 17, married by 19, and had kids soon after. a seemingly unremarkable trajectory for a man of his generation. But beneath that veneer of normalcy lurked a deeply disturbed individual, a predator who moved through life with chilling ease, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. Co-workers, looking back, recalled unsettling details. They remembered a guy who would rewire apartment intercoms, not for repair, but to eavesdrop on tenants, a chilling precursor to his later manipulative behavior. They spoke of him keeping bolt cutters in his trunk, not for work, but with a casual, unsettling explanation, just in case. These weren't the quirks of an eccentric handyman. They were the red flags of a calculating, dangerous individual. Rasmussen was a true drifter, a phantom moving from state to state, never staying in one place long enough to establish deep roots or face true scrutiny. Colorado, Arizona, Texas, New Hampshire, California, a winding, cross-country path that allowed him to shed identities and escape his past. Along the way, he bigamously married at least 4 women, often under a dizzying array of aliases: Gordon Jensen, Curtis Kimball, Larry Vanner. Each new name was a fresh start, a new mask to hide his true nature. And when his partners, inevitably, started asking too many questions, when they began to glimpse the darkness beneath the surface, they tended to disappear. Police now believe he killed at least 6 people in total, though some investigators, looking at the blanks in his timeline and the sheer number of women who vanished from his life, estimate that number could easily be double that. His specialty was erasure. He was a master of severing ties, of making people vanish without a trace long before the internet made such a feat nearly impossible. He burned documents, moved bodies across state lines to confuse jurisdictions, and perfected the art of pre-internet ghosting, leaving no digital footprint, just empty spaces in people's lives. The Bear Brook murders fit his modus operandi perfectly. Isolate victims, often women with children who were already somewhat vulnerable or estranged from their families, kill them with brutal efficiency, and then obscure their identities and dispose of their bodies in remote locations. One investigator, trying to capture the essence of his insidious nature, called him a slow-motion tornado. You don't realize the devastation he's wrought, the life he's destroyed, until the sky clears and you look around, and half your family is simply gone, leaving a void that can never be filled. The irony of his eventual capture is profound. In 2002, cops in Richmond, California, arrested him for a relatively minor crime: forging checks belonging to his then-missing girlfriend, Jun. While he was in custody, they searched his trailer, a grim, final piece of evidence. And there, buried beneath a layer of kitty litter, they found Yoon-soon's body. He eventually pleaded no contest to her murder, a legal maneuver to avoid a trial, and died in prison 8 years later from lung cancer. At the time of his death in 2010, no one, not a single person, connected him to the horrific cold cases in New Hampshire. The connections, the damning evidence, would only surface years later when the quiet revolution of genetic genealogy finally bloomed. Without the cousin-matching technology, without those dedicated genealogists, Terry Petter Rasmussen would have taken Allenstown's deepest, darkest secrets to his grave, and his victims would likely still be nameless. So, with the monster identified, the chilling question arises: did anyone truly pay? Terry Petter Rasmussen, the man responsible for such unspeakable atrocities, died of lung cancer in a California prison in 2010. He was reportedly cuffed to a gurney in his final moments, but he passed away before New Hampshire authorities could even begin the process of extraditing him to face charges for the Bear Brook murders. For the families, it was a bitter pill to swallow. The killer was gone, but he never truly faced justice in a courtroom for what he did to Marlies, Ray, Marie, and Sarah. Some of the surviving families, understandably, wanted more. They pushed for the possibility of posthumous prosecution, a symbolic act to ensure his name was legally tied to these crimes, even in death. But prosecutors, after careful consideration, declined. The resources required, the complex legal optics of prosecuting a dead man, and the argument that closure is closure, that knowing who did it was enough for many, ultimately led to that decision. It was a pragmatic choice, perhaps, but one that left a lingering sense of unfinished business for some. Instead, the state of New Hampshire, in a beautiful and poignant act of remembrance, held a public memorial in 2023. It wasn't a trial, but it was a testament to the lives lost and finally reclaimed. Survivors, some traveling across the country, gathered near the former burial site, a place once synonymous with horror, now transformed into a space for healing. They planted 4 maple trees, one for each victim, their roots reaching into the soil where such darkness once lay. The names, Marlies, Ray, Marie, Sarah, were read aloud, their identities finally spoken into the wind. Strangers, moved by the story, left flowers, small tokens of remembrance. A simple stone marker was placed, etched not with death dates, because no one knows the exact nights they died, but with their birth dates. A powerful statement that they lived, they were loved, and they are remembered. It's a quiet justice, isn't it? Not the thunderous gavel of a courtroom, but the gentle rustle of leaves, the quiet dignity of memory. But sometimes, in the brutal landscape of true crime, that's all you get. For armchair detectives and those captivated by these stories, the moral is crystal clear, almost a mantra. Killers age, but DNA doesn't. The science, far from static, only gets better, more refined, more powerful. The net, once full of gaping holes, only tightens. If you committed a crime in 1980, if you thought the world forgot, if you believed your secrets were buried forever, think again. That second cousin's Christmas impulse buy, that innocent swab of a cheek, might just be the thread that unravels your carefully constructed lies next. The past, it turns out, has a very long memory. Okay, let's do a quick crash course so you can impress your group chat next time this topic comes up. How does this genetic genealogy actually work beyond the headlines? It sounds like magic, right? But it's really just incredibly tenacious science, meticulous record keeping, and a whole lot of patience. First, the basics. Every single cell in your body, from your hair follicles to your bone marrow, carries your unique genetic blueprint, organized into 23 pairs of chromosomes. When a crime occurs and traditional methods fail, crime scene techs become genetic archaeologists. They meticulously extract DNA from any viable source, a tiny bone fragment, a tooth, even a single rootless hair if they're lucky. The key is to get enough intact genetic material. Once they have that precious sample, they sequence it. This means they read the specific order of your A's, T's, C's, and G's, the chemical letters that make up your genetic code. This raw data, a massive text file of your unique sequence, is then uploaded to a public genetic genealogy database like GeneMatch or Family Tree DNA. These aren't the commercial sites like Ancestry or 23andMe directly, but rather platforms where users can upload their raw data from those sites, specifically opting in to allow comparisons with others. This is where the magic, or rather, the sophisticated algorithms, happens. These algorithms compare hundreds of thousands of single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, pronounced SNPs. Think of SNPs as tiny, individual genetic typos, single-letter variations in your DNA sequence that make you unique. The algorithms are looking for shared segments of these SNPs between the unknown crime scene DNA and the DNA of every single person in the database. When matches are found, they're measured in centimorgans, CMS. Imagine your genetic instruction manual as a huge book. Centimorgans are like shared pages in that instruction manual. The more pages you share with someone, the closer your genetic relationship. A full sibling might share thousands of CMS, a first cousin hundreds, and a distant cousin significantly fewer, but still enough to be detectable. Now, this is where the human element, the genealogist's part, comes in. These aren't just algorithms doing the work. Skilled genetic genealogists take those lists of matches and their shared CMS. They then start building what are called triangulated groups, clusters of people who all share specific segments of DNA with each other and the unknown person. From these groups, they can infer a common ancestor. This isn't a quick process. It involves cross-referencing public records, birth records, census forms, obituaries, old newspaper articles, marriage licenses, anything that can help trace family lines backward and forward through time. They build massive family trees, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of individuals deep, all stemming from that inferred common ancestor. Once they have a sprawling family tree, they start walking it downward, looking for potential candidates. They're searching for someone who fits the profile of the unknown person or the suspect. Someone who is the right age, who is in the right geographical place at the right time, and crucially, someone who has unexplained gaps in their life timeline. Periods where they simply vanish from public records, perhaps around the time of the crime. Once they have a strong candidate, investigators don't just arrest them based on a DNA match from a public database. That's a lead, not evidence. They then discreetly collect discarded DNA from the candidate, a coffee cup from a trash can, a cigarette butt, a used napkin. This new sample is then sent to a forensic lab for traditional, court-admissible DNA testing. And if it's a match, a boom moment, then they have their suspect. So it's not magic. It's tenacity, combined with sophisticated spreadsheets, cutting-edge chemistry, and an incredible amount of detailed historical research. And this powerful combination just solved a quadruple homicide older than the World Wide Web itself, proving that even the most deeply buried secrets can eventually be unearthed. You might hear people ask, and it's a fair question, why spend precious resources, time, and money on 40-year-old murders when there's so much fresh crime happening right now? It's a valid point in a world with limited budgets and endless emergencies. But there are compelling, deeply human, and strategically important reasons why solving cold cases absolutely matters. Let me give you 3. 1. Closure is real, and it's profound. For the families of victims, the pain of loss is compounded by the agony of the unknown. PTSD doesn't punch a time clock. It doesn't fade just because decades have passed. Families relive the uncertainty, the unanswered questions, every birthday, every holiday, every time a new piece of news about the case, or lack thereof, surfaces. Knowing who, and sometimes why, brings an end to that agonizing limbo. It allows grief to finally begin its true work, moving from frantic searching to mournful remembrance. It's not just about an abstract concept of justice. It's about healing broken hearts. 2. Deterrence. Every single solved cold case sends a chilling, undeniable message to today's would-be killers, to those who believe they can escape consequences if enough time passes. That whisper becomes a roar. We will never stop looking. We will never forget. You may evade us for years, even decades, but the technology is advancing, and we will eventually find you. This isn't just theory. It's a powerful, tangible threat. It reinforces the idea that justice, though sometimes delayed, is not denied. It reminds criminals that the long arm of the law, empowered by science, has an increasingly long reach. 3. Science beta tests on old evidence. Cold cases, ironically, are often the proving ground for groundbreaking forensic techniques. The same techniques and methodologies that cracked the Bear Brook case. Genetic genealogy, advanced DNA sequencing, mitochondrial profiling, are not confined to dusty old files. They are now actively being applied to solve current rapes, identify unclaimed remains of veterans and homeless individuals, and even reunite adoptees with their birth parents. Society learns and innovates by looking at yesterday's scraps, by applying new knowledge to old problems. The lessons learned, the protocols established, the technologies refined on cold cases are then immediately transferable, helping us solve tomorrow's emergencies and prevent future tragedies. And let's be honest, there's another, more casual, but incredibly impactful reason. True crime fans, like you, actually fund innovation. Every DNA kit bought by a curious consumer, every podcast streamed, every documentary watched, contributes to the ecosystem that subsidizes the very lab work that cash-strapped police departments and underfunded forensic labs can't always afford on their own. Your fascination, your curiosity, literally pays for lab centrifuges, for advanced sequencing machines, for the training of new genetic genealogists. So yes, binge responsibly. Your true crime obsession isn't just entertainment. It's a quiet, powerful force for justice. If you feel moved to help crack the next cold case, or perhaps identify a missing person, consider uploading your DNA file to a public database like GEDmatch and opt in for law enforcement matching. It costs you absolutely zero, and it might just be the link that catches a killer or brings a family peace. You'll find links to these databases below. We have no affiliation, just a belief in their power. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button, We drop another solved but satisfying mystery every single week. The grim reality of a serial killer like Terry Petter Rasmussen is that the Bear Brook victims, heartbreaking as their story is, were likely not his only victims. Rasmussen's timeline is riddled with blanks, stretches of time where he simply vanished from official records, resurfacing in new towns with new aliases. Detectives are now diligently retracing his steps, looking at his movements. Texas in '79, Oregon in '81, Virginia in '88. These aren't just dates and places on a map. They are potential crime scenes, areas where he could have left other victims. Investigators in at least 3 states are actively retesting evidence, revisiting cold cases, and searching remote locations, old barrels, forgotten crawl spaces, abandoned mine shafts, hoping to find more answers. They've already tied him to Denise Bowden, a New Hampshire woman who vanished with her infant daughter in 1981, just a few years before the first barrel was discovered. Rasmussen, true to his manipulative nature, claimed Denise had abandoned them, leaving him to raise the baby. That infant, Lisa, now a grown woman, a survivor of Rasmussen's twisted world, has become a powerful advocate. She testified at legislative hearings, pushing for expanded genetic database access, her voice a testament to the enduring impact of his crimes. Investigators believe, with a chilling certainty, that there are more girls out there, perhaps boys too, possibly even entire families, whose fates are tied to Terry Petter Rasmussen. His pattern of preying on vulnerable individuals, especially women with children, suggests a wider scope of devastation. This is where the community comes in. If you lived in an old trailer park or any transient community during the late '70s, '80s, or early '90s, and you remember a handyman who kept to himself, who owned bolt cutters, who seemed to pick up and leave suddenly without explanation, please call it in. Even a faint rumor, a fleeting memory, a seemingly insignificant detail can be the missing piece. Every extra tidbit, every forgotten anecdote, helps redraw the map of his movements, narrows the haystack of possibilities, and moves another family one crucial step closer to answers, to finally knowing what happened to their loved ones. The search for justice, for truth, continues. Back in Allenstown, New Hampshire, the site of such profound horror, life has taken on a new, yet different, rhythm. Park rangers, who for decades carried the weight of the unsolved mystery, say the woods feel lighter now. There's a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Dog walkers, families out for a stroll, now leave painted rocks along the trails, small, colorful tributes. Some simply bear the names Ray, Sarah, Marie, Marlies. It's a quiet, beautiful way for the community to acknowledge and remember, to reclaim the space from the darkness. Locals report fewer weird late-night sounds emanating from the woods, though skeptics, ever practical, attribute it to nothing more than the natural cycles of coyotes. But for those who lived with the mystery, the change feels real. For the Honeychurch family, 2023 brought a bittersweet sense of closure. They held a funeral, a service for Marlies and Ray, though it featured 4 empty caskets. It was a symbolic act, yes, but a necessary one, enough to finally allow them to begin grieving properly, publicly, with the knowledge of who their loved ones were. They played Somewhere Over the Rainbow on an acoustic guitar, a poignant melody of hope and remembrance. Half the town showed up, a testament to the community's shared grief and solidarity. Across the country, the Vaughns and McQuarters families, now connected by shared tragedy and a monstrous killer, held joint services in California for Marie and Sarah. The services were live-streamed back to New Hampshire, a powerful reminder that geography shouldn't limit love or the need for collective mourning. These families, once separated by distance and decades of silence, found solace and strength in each other. Story 5: How a Family Tree Exposed California's Most Evil Killer. Alright, listen up. Imagine this. Citrus Heights, California, 2018. A picture-perfect suburban cul-de-sac. You know the kind. Sprinklers ticking away a gentle rhythm. A grandpa meticulously pruning his roses. The scent of freshly cut grass hanging in the air. Everything just screams quiet, safe, ordinary. But here's the chilling truth. Behind one of those ranch house curtains, living a life of quiet normalcy, sat a monster. Not just a monster, but the man who had raped dozens of women, bludgeoned fathers, tied up toddlers, and, in a horrifying display of cold indifference, ate cereal while they bled. For 43 agonizing years, the Golden State Killer was nothing more than a terrifying phantom, a ghost in the shadows of California's collective memory. Then, something incredible happened. A stranger, completely unrelated to the case, mailed in her saliva for a hobby, and his own family tree slammed the prison door shut on him forever. It's a story that sounds like fiction, but it's brutally, beautifully real. Between 1974 and 1986, life in California felt like it was lived in two distinct time zones. There was daylight, a fragile period of perceived safety, and then there was the hour after the killer cut the phone lines. That hour, that terrifying window of vulnerability, defined a generation. He started small, if you can even call it that, as the Visalia ransacker. He'd break into homes, stealing odd, seemingly random items, blue chip stamps, single earrings, things that made no sense to investigators at first. Was it a calling card? A psychological quirk? No one knew. But by 1976, something shifted. He crossed the Calvine Corridor, that invisible line, and transformed Sacramento's serene, tree-lined streets into his personal hunting grounds. The attacks grew more brazen, more savage, more psychologically torturous. Victims would hear whispered threats through clenched teeth, chilling promises like, "I'll kill your folks if you talk." He'd stack dishes on men's chests, a grotesque game of human Jenga, warning that if a single plate slipped, he'd shoot. He didn't just assault, he terrorized. He'd even take driver's licenses, a horrifying detail that allowed him to taunt survivors years later, sometimes calling them, his voice a phantom from their nightmares, whispering, "Gonna kill you, Bonnie." Detectives, overwhelmed and under-resourced, counted 50 rapes, 13 murders, and well over 100 burglaries. The sheer scale of his crimes was unfathomable. The press, desperate to label the elusive predator, tried to capture his essence. He was the East Area rapist at first, then the original Night Stalker as his reign of terror spread south, and finally, the Golden State Killer, a name that perfectly encapsulated his vast and terrifying reach across California. Whatever the name, the impact was visceral, immediate, and deeply personal. Mothers slept with kitchen knives tucked close to their beds. Kids learned to crawl through windows to reach 9/11, a chilling testament to the fear he instilled. Entire neighborhoods bought dogs, not for companionship, but as living alarm systems, animals that barked frantically at the wind, at shadows, at anything that stirred in the dead of night. California was a state holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, living under the shadow of a monster no one could catch. Then, as abruptly as they began, the attacks stopped. By 1988, a chilling silence fell across California, but it offered no peace. Instead, it left behind a gaping wound of unanswered questions and profound frustration. Detectives, tireless but ultimately stumped, had chased down some 150 suspects. They'd painstakingly compared 150,000 fingerprints, a monumental task in the pre-digital age, each one a dead end. They ran the killer's DNA against every felon in the state, hoping for a hit from Cody's, the FBI's national database. Nothing, just a blank, mocking stare from the system. It was a cold case, frozen solid. Enter Paul Holes, a forensic intelligence analyst whose name would become synonymous with the Golden State Killer case. For 24 grueling years, this man dedicated his life to a ghost. He wasn't just working the case, he was obsessed with it. He meticulously mapped bullet casings, cataloged shoe prints, even studied sperm heads, those tiny biological markers no wider than a red blood cell. Every minuscule detail was a potential clue, a thread to pull. Yet, despite his relentless pursuit, the man in the ski mask remained the one that got away, a taunting whisper in the halls of justice. Victims aged, their memories scarred, but their hope for justice slowly dimming. Parents died, never knowing who had stolen their children. Evidence boxes yellowed, stacked high in forgotten storage rooms, a physical representation of fading leads and cold despair. In 2001, a judge, recognizing the desperation, approved the killer's full genetic code to be uploaded to Cody's, a groundbreaking move at the time. The hope was palpable, but again, nothing. The database, designed to catch criminals through DNA, offered no answers. Holes, in a moment of dark humor born of sheer desperation, even considered disassembling every single shotgun in California, hoping to find a match. His colleagues, watching him chase shadows for decades, half-joked that he'd need a Ouija board to solve it. Hope, once a flickering flame, had finally frosted over, leaving behind only the bitter chill of an unsolved mystery. How do you catch someone who leaves no trace? Someone who seems to simply vanish into thin air? For years, no one had an answer. Fast forward to 2016. Paul Holes, officially retired from active duty but clearly unable to truly let go, sat at his kitchen table. The quiet hum of his home was a stark contrast to the buzzing in his mind as he scrolled through crime scene photos on an iPad. It was a ritual, a silent conversation with the past. His eyes kept snagging on one image in particular, an orange-labeled tube holding the precious, elusive DNA from murder number 5, the brutal 1979 killings of Drive Robert Offerman and Dr. Alexandria Manning. He'd stared at this image countless times, but this time, a thought hit him. It wasn't just a thought. It was a jolt, a surge of pure caffeine straight to the brain. Public genealogy sites, GEDmatch, family tree DNA. These weren't tools for law enforcement. They were playgrounds for hobbyists, for people trying to trace their family roots, to find distant cousins, all for fun. Law enforcement had never truly weaponized that data, never thought to use it to hunt down criminals. But what if? What if he could load the killer's genome, this ghost's genetic blueprint, into one of these databases? Maybe, just maybe, a hobbyist meticulously built Christmas tree genealogy, those sprawling, intricate family trees, would point right back to the monster they'd been hunting for decades. The idea was, frankly, radioactive. It was a legal minefield, a public relations nightmare waiting to happen. Privacy lawsuits, chain of custody challenges, headlines screaming, "Big Brother is watching." All these concerns flooded his mind. It was a radical, untested approach, fraught with ethical dilemmas. But the alternative was another decade of cold silence. So despite the monumental risks, Holes did it. He emailed the FBI, a short, almost casual message that belied the seismic potential of his suggestion. Long shot. Could work. Thoughts? The reply pinged back in minutes, just as terse, just as loaded. Do it quietly. And just like that, a desperate, last-ditch effort was born, whispered into existence, far from the public eye. The call went out to C.C. Moore, a name revered in the nascent world of genetic genealogy. She was a legend, known for solving adoption mysteries in a mere 48 hours, connecting long-lost families with astonishing speed. But this was different. This wasn't about finding a birth parent. It was about finding a killer. She had no name, no existing tree, just 20 segments of DNA from a crime scene, and a solemn promise of absolute secrecy. It was a needle in a haystack, a challenge unlike any she'd faced. Her first step, convert the raw crime scene DNA profile into SNP format, the standardized language that chip spit kit companies use. Think of it as translating a complex code into a universal language. Then came the upload. She chose a Sunday morning, a strategic move, knowing that most users would be at brunch, ensuring maximum visibility and potential matches. Third step, the agonizing wait for those crucial centimorgans to roll in. Centimorgans, for the uninitiated, are units of genetic linkage, essentially measuring how much DNA you share with someone. The higher the number, the closer the relationship. And they did roll in. Matches started appearing, not direct hits, of course, but distant relatives. A third cousin, the great-granddaughter of a Norwegian immigrant, the great-great-grandson of a Missouri homesteader. Each match was a tiny thread, a clue to an ancestor, a branch on a tree. Moore, with her unparalleled expertise, began to build trees outward from these matches, meticulously charting their lineages. Then, she worked inward, pruning away branches that didn't fit the known geographical areas of the crimes, the age ranges of potential suspects, or the Y chromosome haplogroup, the paternal line, that had been identified from the killer's DNA. It was painstaking work, a colossal puzzle. She hunted for clues, for common ancestors. She found a pair of great-great-grandparents who had produced 4 sons in Iowa in the 1870s. This was a critical lead. Only one of those family lines, she discovered, had migrated to California during the Dust Bowl, following the promise of a new life. Generation by generation, she narrowed the field, inching closer to the truth. Until, finally, a single great-grandfather emerged, a man who had birthed 9 grandkids in Sacramento County. One of those grandkids, her research revealed, had been a police officer, a Vietnam MP, later fired for shoplifting. A small, curious detail that would prove profoundly significant. He fit the age profile perfectly, born in 1945. He lived within the very clusters where the rapes and murders had occurred. He even owned a beige 1975 Plymouth GTX, a car that eerily matched witness descriptions from decades earlier. His nickname in the academy? Jerry the Cop. His name? Joseph James D'Angelo. The ghost had a face. April 18, 2018. The suburban idyll of Citrus Heights was shattered, not by violence, but by the quiet, intense presence of surveillance teams. They camped outside Joseph James D'Angelo's unassuming beige stucco house, watching his every mundane move. They saw him building birdhouses, a picture of domesticity. They heard him scream at reporters about parking tickets, a flash of temper that hinted at something beneath the surface. They trailed him on his grocery runs, meticulously, covertly collecting samples. The handle of a shopping cart he'd touched, a tissue he'd blown into and carelessly discarded, a crust of pizza he'd tossed in the trash. Each tiny piece of potential evidence, carefully bagged and labeled, headed straight to the Sacramento Crime Lab, a race against time and a desperate hope for a definitive match. The stakes were impossibly high. They needed a pristine, undeniable sample. And then, at 2:30 a.m. on March 24th, a detective made his move. He lifted the driver's door handle of D'Angelo's car, pure touch DNA, a direct, uncontaminated sample. That sample, when tested, matched the 1979 murder kit with a probability so astronomically high it's almost incomprehensible, 1 in 10 septillion. To put that into perspective, that's a 1 followed by 25 zeros. It wasn't just a match, it was an absolute certainty. The ghost was real. On April 24th, the final act began. Deputies staged a noise complaint down the street, a mundane ruse to draw him out. D'Angelo, seemingly unfazed, stepped outside in cargo shorts, no shirt, his belly slack, his pale blue eyes blinking in the early evening light. "What's the problem?" he asked, his voice betraying no hint of the monstrous past he carried. Before he could react, an officer tackled him. Others moved in, their cuffs clicking shut around his wrists. Neighbors, peering through their blinds, watched in stunned silence. The grandfather who fixed lawnmower blades, the man who once chased a dog with a machete, a chilling anecdote now viewed through a terrifying new lens. The seemingly benign figure who taught local girls to ride bikes. He was the monster. The quiet suburban street had been harboring California's most evil killer for decades. Inside his house, among the ordinary clutter of an ordinary life, investigators found a stained dinner bell. It had been stolen in 1976, the same year he raped a 16-year-old babysitter 2 blocks away. The trophy, a tangible link to his reign of terror, had been sitting there all along. June 29, 2020. The courtroom was packed, a sea of faces etched with decades of pain, trauma, and finally, a glimmer of hope. Victims, survivors, and their families filled every seat, their collective presence a powerful testament to the enduring impact of Joseph James D'Angelo's crimes. He sat motionless in his orange jumpsuit, a man stripped of his power, as survivors, many now elderly, bravely stood before him and read their impact statements. One woman, her voice trembling but resolute, held up the bathing suit she wore at age 13 the night he assaulted her. It still had the buckshot holes. The raw, visceral display of her enduring agony silenced the room, a harrowing reminder of the lives he had irrevocably shattered. Judge Michael Bowman didn't mince words. It has cracked open more than 500 previously impenetrable cases, bringing closure to countless families. We've seen it in the high-profile Idaho student murders, in the hunt for the NorCal rapist, and in the tragic 1987 double homicide of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg. It's a new era of justice, one where DNA, once a dead end, now offers a lifeline. But this powerful new tool isn't without its complexities. States across the country have been grappling with rewriting privacy laws, trying to strike a balance between public safety and individual rights. Some now require warrants for law enforcement to access these databases, while others allow open upload, sparking heated debates about digital ethics. Millions of people, suddenly aware of the implications, have opted out of public matching, choosing to protect their genetic privacy. Yet, thousands more continue clicking accept on those terms and conditions, often unknowingly building an ever-expanding net that may very well snag the next killer, the next ghost haunting our communities. Paul Holes, ever the investigator, keeps a map on his study wall, a living testament to this new frontier. Red pins mark every new arrest made possible by genetic genealogy. He calls it the orchard, a poignant metaphor for family trees dropping bad apples directly into handcuffs. It's a powerful, almost poetic image of justice unfolding, one genetic connection at a time. So, if you learned something wild today, something that makes you think about the hidden power of your own family tree, then do us a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Tell YouTube's algorithm you want more stories where curiosity, tenacity, and groundbreaking science team up to catch criminals. And here's a question for you to drop in the comments. Would you upload your DNA to help solve a cold case? Or does that cross a privacy line you're not willing to breach? We'd love to hear your thoughts. For decades of terror, a reign of fear that gripped an entire state, ended not with a dramatic car chase, not with a tearful confession, but with something far more profound. A tiny, almost invisible leaf on a genealogical chart. One relative's simple curiosity, her decision to explore her own family history, ultimately dragged Joseph James D'Angelo from the shadows, proving once and for all that the past is never truly past. It's just waiting for its match.